Hi everyone, welcome back to the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. My name is Brandy and this week we are working on this piece that's behind me, and this is actually one that I worked on live over the course of a few weeks with everybody together, and it was a really fun piece. In fact, the hardest part about this one for me was that I had to keep pushing pause on it so that I could keep it ready for the next week's live when I wanted to just binge work on it and just finish the piece. And that sometimes is one of the hardest parts about doing YouTube videos, is sometimes I have to pause my creative process and stop it and make sure it's ready for video, even when I'm ready to just keep moving on it. So this is actually a new collection from Redesign with Prima. My inspiration for this was kind of a dark, mysterious, apothecary kind of cabinet, and maybe these little frames are little windows into what's going on in the cabinet. Cabinet of Curiosities came to mind. That was kind of a dark show that we watched, and this kind of reminded me of it. Just a little bit of mystery, kind of tells the story, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with it. So I was really inspired by this collection. We're going to use a bunch of fun techniques, or fun paint technique, obviously a lot of molds. There's a really cool transfer on this one. A little bit of fun accent techniques that we're going to do. So I think it's really fun, and I'm loving how it comes together. It's honestly probably been one of my favorites in a long time to work on, and I hope it's one of your favorites to watch. Let's go ahead and get started. Here's where I started on this piece. I picked this one up off my local Facebook marketplace. I fell in love with the hardware. It's actually a really well made piece. I knew right away I wanted to do a wood stain top on this one. It's got a beautiful inlay that runs around the outside, so I put a coat of stripper on it, and I'm going to go ahead and scrape off the old finish using a metal scraper blade. Next, I need to start paying attention to the body, and so I went ahead and gave this one a really good cleaning, removed all that old hardware. I'm going to go ahead and clean those too, and while that's out, I'm going to scuff sand the surface of this using my Surf Prep sander. I also needed to give this one a coat of Lysandra primer. This is Lysandra primer in light gray. It's my favorite primer to use. It's a stain blocking and a gripping primer in one, so it takes care of everything I need. It's really the only primer that I tend to use anymore. I don't think I've ever had one of these pieces with the White pulls on it, which are those oval style pulls that didn't tend to be a bleeder. So that could be a dead giveaway. The age of this piece and the type of wood, I knew that this one was going to bleed, so I needed that coat of primer underneath. I started out by using some blues on this one, and I wasn't really sure what color combination I wanted to use. So this is YSL paint in Poseidon and Siren Song. It's a gorgeous color combination, and I think I'm just going to let these blues peek through, and my final color combination is actually going to be some greens over the top. So let's layer these colors a little bit later. So you saw a sneak peek of this piece at the beginning of this video, and you know I used a ton of molds. Well, these are all the molds. I laid them all out on my resin station in my workshop, and I'm going to pour them all at one time. So I mixed my resin into some larger quantities, and then with these all laid out, I'm just going to move really quickly. I ended up pouring, I think this is about 6 or 7 molds, and I did 3 pours total. So that gave me enough molds to cover the front of my piece. To pour these molds, I'm using amazing casting resin, and you mix equal parts of part A and B, and I mix them into a silicone cup, and then I'm going to move pretty quickly. This has a 10-minute cure time, so you've got about 30 seconds to stir, and then about 2 to 3 minutes to get these poured into your mold before that chemical reaction starts and the mold or the resin is going to start curing. I mix it into a silicone cup because I can form the cup into a spout and pour into some of these really fine and tight spaces that I've got on these molds. These frames have some really beautiful details on them, and I want to make sure that that liquid fills all those details. Once I've got all that resin poured, I wait about 10 minutes, and then my molds are going to turn white, and that's how I know that they're cured. These are hardened, and I can go ahead and flex the silicone around them and remove them from the molds. Of course, I got some help on this because I had to pour a ton of molds, and little hands love picking the resin out of the silicone, so we got some helpers here. I hadn't laid out the molds at this point, so I wasn't sure which ones I would use, which ones were just going to be extra, but I actually ended up using most everything I cast. I think I only had about 2 or 3 extra left over by the time I was done placing them all around my piece. So with my base coat of paint laid on, I went ahead and took all these molds over to my piece of furniture, and I'm using Titebond Quick and Thick adhesive, applying that to the back of my molds, and I'm just going to place them. A couple of things I tried to consider is I looked for symmetry. So where I used one mold on one side of the piece, I tried to match it with a bookended set on the other end, so I had nice symmetry, a nice mix of shapes and sizes. And then the other thing I had to be really careful about is making sure that I had room for my hardware. Some of my hardware is going to go inside of frame, some of it won't have a frame, but I had to make sure that the frames I put around those areas also fit the hardware. To do that, I just took a piece of my hardware out and I would dry fit it in the area and then place the frame around it. This is what my piece looks like with all those frames applied. Let's go ahead and get to work on some of this paint finish. So I had all these beautiful frames on my piece, but I really didn't want to glaze them when I was done. I just wanted some dark down in the crevices of them. So I'm going to go ahead and use paint, and I'm going to do it before I put my second coat of paint on. I'm just using a little bit of black paint on an artist brush, and I'm going to dig it into all these crevices. This is going to darken up those crevices, and when I paint over the top, I'll just make sure that I don't dig it into there, and I'm going to use a dry brushing technique. And that way, the outer edges of these frames will still look dark and have some of that nice black mystique around them. All right, so I did decide to go ahead and put this finish in greens. I kind of liked how the greens looked a little more natural and earthy, and with the plan I have for this piece, it seemed to fit a little bit more. I am going to bring in some of those blues, but this color combination that I'm going to paint on in my next coat is actually greens. So I'm using Wise-Owl paint, and this color is called Foxtrot. I'm going to also use a little bit of Spanish olive in the center. I kept some of that Poseidon around the outer edges of the piece, and that was really pretty to just have a little hint of blue around the outer edges of the piece. I love how this green kind of glows. It gives that kind of mysterious look that I was going for. So all I'm doing is a blended finish over the front of this piece, but I'm making sure that I'm not digging this paint into those crevices on the molds because I still want that black frame that I painted out to show through, so they have a little bit of shadowing almost underneath. I'm also using kind of irregular brush strokes, so this paint finish has a little bit of texture to it. I think that adds to the organic feel of it to not have this be super clean and smooth. So I started out with the Foxtrot, and that's because that's kind of my medium tone in this case, and it blends well into the Poseidon, but it's also going to blend into that Spanish olive in the center of it. Let's go ahead and put a little bit of music on and finish up getting this second coat of paint on. All right, so now that I've got my greens applied, I want to go ahead and bring in some of those blues, a little bit stronger blues. And so for this, I'm going to use a dry brushing technique. I went ahead and took a nice fluffy natural bristle brush, and I'm dry brushing a little bit of Poseidon and Siren Song over the top of my molds. This is just going to catch some of the texture from those brush strokes that I used when I applied the greens, and it's also going to pick up on the edges of all of my molds. I'm thrilled with how the layers of color came together on this piece. I had the blues underneath. I added that little bit of black and then some greens and then the dry brushing. But I want to add a little bit of depth in some places around the edge of these frames and on the inside. So for that, I'm going to use some black wax. In case you guys haven't noticed, I'm a huge fan of my black wax. This is Annie Sloan black wax, and I'm going to use it to outline these frames, and then I'm going to take a slightly larger brush and I'm just going to smudge that out. That's just going to kind of add a little bit of shadowing and depth and dimension around the edge of the frames. I tend to spend almost as much time on the wax on some pieces as I do on the actual paint itself, and I just love doing wax work. It's one of my favorite things to do, but you can see how this just adds a little bit of shadowing to the paint. So I always tend to layer my effects with paint and then the wax and the molds and the transfers, and all together it makes a complete look. So I've got all these little tiny frames on my piece. Well, what exactly are they framing? The answer is going to be transfers. So I'm using this new transfer from Redesign with Prima. This one is called Collector's Closet, and it was perfect. I was really inspired by this transfer and the frames. This is how the look kind of came together in my head. So I started out by taking the Collector's Closet transfer and I cut each individual piece out, and then I'm going to tape them up on my piece to find their placement. I just took a little bit of painter's tape and I started out with some of my larger areas and I fit those first. And then next I moved down to some of the smaller ones, the ones that are a little more specific and I can only fit certain things inside them. So I had to move some pieces around and play around with it just like a puzzle to find a piece to go inside every frame. Once I had my overall layout decided and each frame had a piece that went with it, I started by applying these transfers one by one, and each one needed to be cut and customized to the size of the frame that it was going to go inside of. I was really impressed that this one transfer ended up doing this entire piece, and I had something inside every frame. It was awesome. I actually only had a couple scraps left over too, so it was really the perfect size. Once I had my layout decided and each frame had a piece of transfer that was going to go inside it, I need to start applying the transfer. So I'm going to start out with this little book, and this is going to go inside this frame here. I did cut these books in half. It's a piece of a larger image, but they work cut in half as well. I'm going to rub them on using the transfer tool that comes inside the package, and I'm going to pull away the clear backing sheet as I go, and it's going to leave this book design inside my frame. And then if I move to the other side of my piece, you can see where I talked in the beginning about making sure I had symmetry in my design. And I did that with my transfers as well. So where I applied this book inside of this frame on one side, I'm going to come match it over on the other side as well. These frames are going to have a piece of hardware in the center of them, but I didn't let that bother me. I'm going to just go ahead and apply my hardware over the top of the transfer, and so the piece looks cohesive. Any transfers that were too big for the spot that they needed to go in, I either cut out the section that I wanted using a razor knife or a pair of scissors, or I trimmed them up once they were inside the frame using that razor knife. So these were some of the bigger designs, but let's see how some of the smaller transfers go inside their frames as well. This little bug is a perfect example. Once I had all my pieces taped in place, I found his placement. You can see this frame frames him out really well. He matches great with the colors in the background. I've got the little medicine bottle that's going to go over on the side of him. Some of the little tiny frames I didn't worry about putting anything inside of, and then of course I have the keyholes above, and those didn't get anything inside of them either. Once I had all the designs inside my frame, I wanted to add a little bit of interest, and I felt like I needed some contrast, maybe with some oranges and some reds. So I mixed up this color using a Wise-Owl paint, and I used a little bit of iron oxide. It's got some Republic red in it. I layered it with some Dijon, and I kind of wanted to create this little bit of a rust effect. I applied it around the bottom of my frames, and then I just used a little bit of water to let it run naturally. I tapped it with a rag so that I could remove any excess, and it kind of gave me this naturally rusted effect. Once I applied my transfers and my rusting effect around the frames, they needed just a little more black wax, and so I added that just around the outside using this fluffy artist brush. My frames are perfectly drippy and grungy, and they're framing out their piece of art inside of them all. So my next step is I want to accentuate the frames themselves. These frame molds have some incredible details on them, and just painted in my background color, you don't really notice it as much. So I'm going to use a little bit of redesign with Prima decor wax. This color is called Eternal, and I'm just going to wipe it around the edges of my frames using my finger, and I also used an artist brush on some. You could really make your frames any color you want if you wanted them to be bronze or silver or copper. I chose gold on these because I thought it fit really nicely against the background of the greens. I'm also going to use a little bit of the same decor wax on my hardware. So I just painted these with my flat black chalk paint from Wysal Paint. And then I'm going to go over them with my finger just to bring out some details on the hardware itself. You can see how they fit inside those frames, and they almost kind of disappear into the body of the piece itself. All right, so I sprayed this one with some Wysal matte varnish, and this piece is complete. I left that top in the natural wood because I really like how it complemented the piece. This one has so much interest, you guys. It's just really fun. Everyone who's seen it so far has had to comment on it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this process. You can find links to everything I use in the description for this post. As always, you can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube, and on my website at brushbybrandy.com. Don't forget to click that subscribe button for weekly tutorials here at Brush by Brandy on YouTube.